November 1945. A courtroom in Nuremberg, Germany. 15 Nazi leaders sit in the dock. Not soldiers, not low-level perpetrators, but the architects of genocide themselves. Men who had shaped Nazi policy at the highest levels. Men who had signed orders that resulted in millions of deaths. For the first time in history, a nation's leaders would be held criminally liable for crimes against humanity. The verdicts would be guilty, the sentences would be death, and the executions would establish a legal precedent that would shape international law for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. This is the story of the first trial of a nation's leaders for crimes against humanity, and how 15 executions changed the meaning of justice. May 7, 1945. Nazi Germany surrenders unconditionally. The war in Europe is officially over. The Allies have achieved total victory. Hitler is dead. The Nazi regime has collapsed. But the question facing the Allies is unprecedented. What do you do with the leaders of a defeated nation? What do you do with men who ordered genocide? What do you do with those responsible for starting a war that killed over 50 million people? In previous conflicts, defeated leaders were sometimes executed summarily. They were military losers, stripped of power, often executed without trial. Other times, they were exiled. Still other times, they were negotiated with as sovereign leaders of defeated nations. But the scale of Nazi crimes was different. The Nazis had not just lost a war, they had committed genocide. They had murdered 6 million Jews. They had murdered millions of others. They had conducted a systematic program to exterminate entire peoples. The Allies recognized that this was different. This required a different response. The British, American, and Soviet governments debated what to do. Some argued for summary execution, others argued for imprisonment, still others argued for trials. Eventually, a consensus emerged. The Nazis' top leaders would face trial, not a military court-martial where summary execution was possible, but a real trial, a trial with rules of evidence, a trial with witnesses, a trial where the accused could present a defense, a trial that would examine in detail what the Nazis had done. This trial would be the Nuremberg Trial, officially called the trial of the major war criminals before the International Military Tribunal. 24 defendants would be tried, but the case against 15 of them would be particularly strong. 15 would be convicted and sentenced to death. These 15 were the architects of Nazi genocide. They were the men who had shaped policy. They were the men who had signed orders. They were the men who had created and directed the system that murdered millions. Hermann Göring was among them, Hitler's deputy, head of the Luftwaffe, one of the architects of the persecution of Jews. Rudolf Hess was among them, Hitler's deputy for political affairs, a man who had attempted a secret peace mission to Scotland in 1941. Joachim von Ribbentrop was among them, Nazi foreign minister, a man who had negotiated treaties and coordinated foreign policy. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was among them, head of the Reich Security Main Office, direct responsibility for the concentration camp system and the Holocaust. And 12 others, equally implicated in Nazi crimes. These were not low-level bureaucrats. These were not SS torturers or camp guards. These were the men at the very top of the Nazi hierarchy. The men whose decisions had shaped the course of World War II and the Holocaust. The trial would last 10 months. Hundreds of witnesses would testify. Thousands of documents would be introduced as evidence. The courtroom would hear detailed testimony about the Holocaust, about war crimes, about crimes against humanity. The verdicts came in October 1946. Guilty. Guilty on charges of crimes against humanity. Guilty on charges of war crimes. Guilty on charges of conspiracy to wage aggressive war. 15 death sentences were imposed. On October 16, 1946, the executions were carried out. 15 Nazi leaders were hanged. They faced death for their crimes against humanity. The executions represented a historic moment. For the first time, a nation's leaders had been held criminally liable for crimes against humanity. For the first time, the principle that leaders could not hide behind their position had been established in law. This principle would reverberate through the rest of the 20th century. It would influence how international law developed. It would shape how war crimes tribunals operated. It would establish the foundation for modern international criminal justice. But the path to these executions was complex. The trial itself raised difficult legal and moral questions. The executions raised questions about justice, about proportionality, about the nature of accountability. This documentary tells the story of the 15 Nazi leaders whose executions marked a turning point in history. It examines who they were, what they had done, how they were tried, and what their executions meant for the future of international justice. The 15 Nazi leaders who faced execution at Nuremberg were not random selections from the Nazi regime. They were deliberately chosen because they represented the highest levels of Nazi authority and were directly implicated in the worst crimes. Hermann Göring was the highest-ranking defendant. He was born in 1893, the son of a German diplomat and colonial administrator. He served as a fighter pilot in World War I, becoming a decorated war hero. After the war, he became involved in right-wing politics and eventually joined the Nazi Party. When Hitler came to power, Göring rose rapidly through the Nazi hierarchy. He became head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He was given command of the German economy. He was Hitler's designated successor. He was one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. Göring was directly involved in the persecution of Jews. He had attended a conference in 1938 where the persecution of Jews was discussed and coordinated. He had signed decrees restricting Jewish rights. He was aware of the Holocaust and had benefited from the theft of Jewish property. He was also responsible for terror bombing campaigns against civilian populations. The Luftwaffe conducted bombing raids on British cities, on Polish cities, on cities across Europe. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed. Rudolf Hess was Hitler's deputy for political affairs. He was a true believer in Nazi ideology. He had helped Hitler write Mein Kampf while they were imprisoned together in the 1920s. He was fanatically loyal to the Nazi cause. In 1941, Hess made a dramatic escape from Germany. He flew a fighter plane to Scotland, apparently hoping to negotiate a peace settlement. He was captured, imprisoned, and held by the British for the rest of the war. When he was returned to Germany for trial at Nuremberg, he claimed to have lost his memory. He seemed mentally unstable, alternating between lucidity and confusion, but he was tried nonetheless. Joachim von Ribbentrop was the Nazi foreign minister. He had negotiated the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, which had shocked the world. He had coordinated Nazi foreign policy throughout the war. He had negotiated treaties and alliances. Ribbentrop was directly involved in Nazi racial policy. He had supported the persecution of Jews. He had coordinated with other nations' governments on matters relating to Jewish persecution. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was the head of the Reich Security Main Office, Risha, the organization that oversaw the Gestapo, the SS, and the concentration camps. He had direct responsibility for the Holocaust. Kaltenbrunner took over leadership of this organization in 1943, after Ernst Heydrich was assassinated. As head of the Risha, he was responsible for overseeing the deportation of Jews to extermination camps. He was aware of the killing operations. He signed orders related to the murder of prisoners. Wilhelm Keitel was the commander-in-chief of the German armed forces. As the highest-ranking military officer, he was responsible for military operations and military personnel. He had signed orders that resulted in the killing of prisoners of war and civilians. He had supported the implementation of Nazi ideology within the military. Albert Speer was the Nazi Minister of Armaments and War Production. He was responsible for organizing the German war economy. He had overseen the use of slave labor from concentration camps. He was aware that prisoners were being worked to death. Speer was unique among the defendants, in that he would eventually express some remorse for his actions, and would cooperate with historians and investigators about the Nazi regime. But at the time of trial, he was facing serious charges related to his use of slave labor and his role in the Nazi war effort. Julius Streicher was the publisher of an anti-Semitic newspaper. He had used his platform to promote hatred of Jews. He had participated in the persecution of Jews at the local level in Franconia, Germany. His propaganda had contributed to the dehumanization of Jews and had helped create the climate in which the Holocaust was possible. Hans Frank was the Governor-General of Poland. He had overseen the administration of occupied Polish territory. Under his rule, the Warsaw Ghetto had been established. Hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews had been confined in ghettos. Many had been deported to death camps. Frank was directly responsible for the deaths of millions of Polish Jews and Polish civilians. His administration had been characterized by brutal repression and genocide. Arthur Seyss-Inquart was the Reichskommissar, administrator, of occupied Netherlands. Under his rule, thousands of Dutch Jews had been deported to extermination camps. He had overseen the systematic persecution of the Dutch population. These were just 5 of the 15 men sentenced to death. Each had held significant power in the Nazi regime. Each had been directly involved in crimes against humanity. Each would face trial and execution. The other 10 sentenced to death included other high-ranking officials, military officers, and administrators. Each had participated in Nazi crimes. Each had signed documents, issued orders, or implemented policies that had resulted in death and suffering. What these 15 men had in common was that they were not low-level perpetrators. They were not SS torturers or camp guards. They were the men who had shaped Nazi policy and directed the Nazi system. They had authority. They had power. They had made choices, conscious choices, to implement Nazi racial policy, to wage aggressive war, to commit crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg Trial would examine these choices in meticulous detail. The prosecution at Nuremberg faced an enormous task. They had to prove that these 15 men, and 9 others, were guilty of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and conspiracy to wage aggressive war. The evidence was voluminous. The Nazis had kept meticulous records. They had documented their crimes in writing. Orders for killings were signed. Reports detailing numbers of victims were filed. Transportation records showed the deportation of millions. The prosecution collected thousands of documents. They obtained Nazi records from archives across Europe. They obtained testimony from Nazi officials and staff who were willing to cooperate in exchange for lenient treatment. They also obtained testimony from survivors and witnesses. Survivors testified about what they had witnessed in the ghettos and camps. Witnesses testified about massacres and killings. Robert Jackson, the chief American prosecutor, delivered a powerful opening statement. Jackson argued that the trial was not about revenge. It was about establishing a principle, that nations and their leaders cannot commit genocide and escape accountability. He argued that the trial would establish precedent for international law. The prosecution methodically built its case against each defendant. They presented evidence of that defendant's involvement in specific crimes. They showed chain of command, how orders flowed from the top leadership to lower-level perpetrators. They demonstrated knowledge, that these men knew what was happening and approved of it. For Hermann Göring, the prosecution presented evidence of his involvement in the persecution of Jews, his role in starting the war, his responsibility for bombing campaigns that killed civilians. They presented evidence that he had looted Jewish property. They presented evidence that he had participated in high-level meetings where the genocide was discussed. For Ernst Kaltenbrunner, The prosecution presented evidence of his role in directing the concentration camp system. They presented evidence that he had signed orders related to the killing of prisoners. They presented evidence that he had overseen the deportation of Jews to extermination camps. The prosecution presented testimony from concentration camp survivors. These survivors described what they had witnessed. They described the selection process at Auschwitz, how men and women were selected for immediate death in the gas chambers. They described the systematic nature of the killing. One particularly powerful piece of evidence was a document showing the number of Jews murdered at various locations. The document, prepared by Nazi statisticians, detailed the scale of the genocide. The prosecution used this document to establish the systematic nature of the killings. The prosecution also presented testimony from Nazi officials about the decision-making process. An official who had participated in meetings where the genocide was discussed testified about what had been said. An administrator who had overseen the deportation of Jews testified about the process. This testimony established that the defendants knew what was happening. They knew that deportation meant death. They knew that the Holocaust was occurring. They had participated in the decision-making that led to genocide. The defense presented counter-arguments. Some defendants claimed they were following orders and had no choice. Others claimed they did not know the full extent of what was happening. Others claimed that they had actually tried to minimize casualties. Hermann Göring took the stand in his own defense. He was articulate and composed. He denied knowledge of the Holocaust. He claimed that he had actually tried to prevent the worst excesses of the regime. He characterized himself as a moderate within the Nazi leadership. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Documents contradicted Göring's testimony. Witness testimony contradicted his claims. The evidence showed that Göring had benefited from the theft of Jewish property. The evidence showed that he had participated in persecuting Jews. Ernst Kaltenbrunner also testified in his own defense. He claimed that he was not responsible for the Holocaust. He claimed that he was simply administering the laws passed by the Nazi government. But the prosecution showed that Kaltenbrunner had signed orders. He had participated in meetings about the deportation of Jews. He was aware of the killing operations. He had the power to stop them or refuse to implement them, but he had chosen not to do so. The trial lasted 10 months. The prosecution presented its case meticulously. The defense presented its case. Judges from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union presided. The evidence accumulated. The weight of documentation was overwhelming. The testimony of survivors and witnesses was powerful and consistent. By the end of the trial, it was clear that the prosecution had proven its case. The defendants were guilty. Not just guilty in a moral sense, but guilty in a legal sense. They had committed crimes against humanity. They had violated international law. They had been directly involved in genocide. September 30 and October 1, 1946. The International Military Tribunal delivers its verdicts. The courtroom is packed. Media representatives from around the world are present. The verdicts will be broadcast. The world is watching. The judges deliver their verdicts methodically, defendant by defendant. Hermann Göring, found guilty on all 4 counts, sentenced to death by hanging. Rudolf Hess, found guilty on 2 counts, conspiracy and crimes against peace, sentenced to life imprisonment. Joachim von Ribbentrop, found guilty on all 4 counts, sentenced to death by hanging. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, found guilty on all 4 counts, sentenced to death by hanging. Wilhelm Keitel, found guilty on all 4 counts, sentenced to death by hanging. Albert Speer, found guilty on 3 counts, sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, found guilty on all 4 counts, sentenced to death by hanging. Hans Frank, found guilty on all 4 counts, sentenced to death by hanging. Julius Streicher, found guilty on crimes against humanity, sentenced to death by hanging. And so on through the 24 defendants. In total, 12 defendants receive death sentences. 9 receive prison sentences. 3 are acquitted. Among those sentenced to death are 11 of the original 15 in this documentary. The death sentences are significant. They establish a precedent. These are not low-level perpetrators. These are top-level Nazi leaders. They have been found guilty. They have been sentenced to death. The verdicts are delivered with detailed explanations. The judges explain the evidence they found convincing. They explain how the defendants' actions had contributed to crimes against humanity. The judges note that the defendants cannot hide behind their position as leaders. They note that obedience to orders is not an absolute defense against liability for crimes against humanity. They note that individuals have responsibility to refuse orders that are illegal or immoral. These findings establish important legal principles. They establish that leaders can be held criminally liable for their actions. They establish that command authority is not a shield against accountability. The verdicts are met with mixed reactions. Some view them as appropriate justice for enormous crimes. Others view them as too harsh, arguing that the defendants were merely carrying out political decisions made by Hitler. But the tribunal has spoken. The verdicts are guilty. The sentences are death. There is one dramatic moment during the verdicts. Hermann Göring, the highest-ranking defendant, reacts to his death sentence. He shows no emotion. He sits calmly in the dock, appearing to accept his fate. Some observers note that Göring seems to have expected this outcome. He appears resigned. He shows no outburst or denial. The other defendants respond differently. Some show emotion. Some appear shocked. Some seem to have accepted the verdict before it was delivered. Julius Streicher, the anti-Semitic propagandist, is visibly distressed. He appears to break down emotionally upon hearing the death sentence. His role in promoting anti-Semitism, his use of his newspaper to dehumanize Jews, had been thoroughly documented. The tribunal found him guilty of crimes against humanity. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of Poland, appears deeply affected. He had maintained some dignity during the trial, but the death sentence seems to shake him. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, whose direct involvement in the Holocaust had been thoroughly proven, receives his death sentence without apparent emotion. He sits in the dock, expressionless. The courtroom is silent. The momentous nature of the verdicts is apparent to everyone present. For the first time in history, leaders of a nation have been convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to death. The immediate question is whether the sentences will be carried out. Some argue that they should be commuted. Some argue that execution is too harsh. Some argue for life imprisonment instead. But the tribunal has been clear. The sentences are death. The question now is when the executions will occur. The answer comes quickly. Within weeks of the verdicts, the executions are scheduled. They will occur at Nuremberg prison. They will be carried out by hanging. The date is set, October 16, 1946. October 16, 1946. Nuremberg prison. Early morning hours. The executions are about to begin. 11 Nazi leaders, or perhaps 12, depending on the count, will be hanged for crimes against humanity. The executions are carried out by Albert Pierrepoint, the British executioner. Pierrepoint is considered one of the most skilled hangmen of his era. He approaches the executions with professional precision. The condemned men are brought to the execution chamber one by one. Each is given an opportunity for final words. Each faces the gallows. Hermann Göring is scheduled to be executed. But minutes before his scheduled execution, he cheats the executioner. In his cell, he bites down on a hidden cyanide capsule. He dies by suicide rather than face-hanging. The manner of Göring's death is controversial. Some see it as a final act of defiance. Others see it as an act of cowardice. Some see it as a bitter irony that the highest-ranking Nazi defendant escapes the execution that was meant for him. But for all the others, the executions proceed. Joachim von Ribbentrop is the first to be executed. The former foreign minister walks to the gallows calmly. He does not appear to be struggling. He does not make any final statement. The trap door opens. Ribbentrop falls. His neck breaks. He dies. Ernst Kaltenbrunner is next. The head of the Arschah, the man directly responsible for the concentration camp system and the Holocaust, walks to the gallows. He appears calm. The execution is swift. Wilhelm Keitel, the military commander, follows. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of Poland, follows. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the administrator of occupied Netherlands, follows. Julius Streicher, the anti-Semitic propagandist, is brought to the gallows. Unlike some of the others, Streicher appears distressed. According to witnesses, he shouts anti-Semitic epithets even as he is being executed. One by one, the condemned men are hanged. Some appear resigned. Some appear defiant. Some appear frightened. But each is executed for their crimes against humanity. By the end of the morning, 11 Nazi leaders have been executed. The gallows has been used repeatedly. The rope has been replaced when necessary. The executions have been carried out methodically and efficiently. The executions represent a historic moment. For the first time, leaders of a nation have been held criminally liable for crimes against humanity and executed for those crimes. The bodies are taken away. They are cremated. The ashes are scattered in a river. The Nazis ensure there will be no martyr graves, no memorial sites where followers could gather to commemorate the executed. The news of the executions spreads around the world. Reactions are mixed. Some view the executions as appropriate justice. Some view them as too harsh. Some view them as victor's justice, the winners executing the losers. But the legal principle has been established. Leaders can be held criminally liable for crimes against humanity. Orders from superiors are not an absolute defense. Individual responsibility extends even to the highest levels of government. The Nuremberg Tribunal has spoken. The executions have been carried out. History has recorded the verdicts and the executions. What becomes clear in the aftermath is that the Nuremberg executions established something unprecedented. They established that accountability was possible. They established that the most powerful figures in a defeated nation could be held criminally responsible for their actions. This principle would have enormous implications for international law. It would shape how subsequent war crimes tribunals operated. It would establish the foundation for modern international criminal justice. Decades later, when war crimes tribunals were established for conflicts in Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Cambodia, and other places, they would draw on the precedent established at Nuremberg. They would use similar legal principles. They would establish that leaders could be held accountable. The executions of the 15, or 12, depending on how Göring's suicide is counted, Nazi leaders at Nuremberg thus represented more than just punishment for specific crimes. They represented the beginning of a new era of international justice, an era in which crimes against humanity could be prosecuted, an era in which leaders could be held accountable. The Nuremberg Trial and the executions that followed established important legal precedents that continue to shape international law today. The first major precedent was the establishment of crimes against humanity as a prosecutable offense under international law. Before Nuremberg, there was no established international law against genocide or crimes against humanity. Nations had domestic laws against murder and other crimes, but there was no international legal framework for prosecuting leaders who committed atrocities against their own populations. Nuremberg changed this. The tribunal established that crimes against humanity could be prosecuted under international law. This principle has continued to be refined and expanded in subsequent decades. The second precedent was the principle that obedience to orders is not an absolute defense. The defendants at Nuremberg argued that they were following orders. They argued that they had no choice but to implement Nazi policy. The tribunal rejected this defense. It established that individuals have responsibility to refuse orders that are illegal or immoral. This principle is now known as the Nuremberg defense, and is recognized in international law. The third precedent was the principle that leaders cannot hide behind their official position. The defendants argued that they were acting in their capacity as government officials, and therefore bore no personal responsibility. The tribunal rejected this argument. It established that leaders have personal responsibility for their actions, regardless of their official position. This principle has become fundamental to modern international criminal law. The fourth precedent was the principle that trying defeated leaders is appropriate and necessary. Some argued that the Nuremberg Trial was victor's justice, that the winners were punishing the losers simply because they had won the war. But the tribunal argued that prosecuting crimes against humanity transcends questions of victory and defeat. It established that justice for atrocities is not victor's justice, but universal justice, that crimes against humanity must be prosecuted regardless of whether the perpetrators are on the winning or losing side. These legal innovations established at Nuremberg would be codified in subsequent international law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, drew on principles established at Nuremberg. The Genocide Convention, adopted in 1948, was directly inspired by the Holocaust and prosecuted at Nuremberg. In subsequent decades, when new atrocities occurred, the international community would draw on these precedents. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, established in 1993, used similar legal procedures and similar charges. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, established in 1994, did the same. The International Criminal Court, established in 2002, is the direct successor to Nuremberg. It operates under principles established at Nuremberg. It prosecutes crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide using legal frameworks developed through the Nuremberg precedent. But the impact of Nuremberg extends beyond formal legal institutions. It established a principle that shapes how the world thinks about accountability. It established that powerful leaders cannot commit atrocities and escape justice simply because they held official positions. This principle remains controversial. Some argue that prosecuting leaders is too harsh. Some argue that it makes peace negotiations more difficult. Some argue that it is victor's justice. But the principle established at Nuremberg, that leaders can be held criminally liable for crimes against humanity, has become embedded in international law and international practice. The executions of the 15 Nazi leaders thus represented more than just punishment for specific crimes. They represented the birth of modern international criminal justice. They represented the establishment of principles that would shape how the world responds to atrocities for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st century. The Nuremberg Tribunal was not perfect. It had limitations. Soviet participation was controversial. The Soviet Union had committed its own atrocities, yet was allowed to participate in judging the Nazis. The trial focused on the top Nazi leadership while leaving thousands of lower-level perpetrators unpunished. But despite these limitations, Nuremberg established something important. It established that accountability was possible. It established that justice for atrocities was achievable, even in the chaos of post-war Europe. The executions of the 15 Nazi leaders demonstrated that even the most powerful figures could be held accountable. Even the architects of genocide could be tried, convicted, and executed. This has profound implications. It means that no leader is above the law. It means that crimes against humanity will be prosecuted. It means that perpetrators cannot escape justice simply by being powerful. In the decades since Nuremberg, this principle has been tested and refined. Some war criminals have escaped prosecution. Some have lived out their lives without facing justice. But the principle remains. Accountability is the goal, and international law has been developed to pursue it. The executions at Nuremberg represented the beginning of this journey toward accountability. They represented a statement to the world. Those who commit crimes against humanity will be held responsible. More than 75 years have passed since the executions at Nuremberg. The world has changed dramatically. The Cold War has ended. New technologies have emerged. New forms of conflict have occurred. Yet the principles established at Nuremberg continue to shape how the world responds to crimes against humanity. In recent decades, new war crimes tribunals have been established. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia prosecuted those responsible for genocide in Bosnia and Rwanda. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda prosecuted those responsible for the Rwandan genocide. The International Court of Justice, based in The Hague, continues to prosecute crimes against humanity and war crimes. All of these institutions draw directly on precedents established at Nuremberg. They use similar legal procedures. They prosecute similar charges. They operate under the principle that accountability is possible, even decades after atrocities have occurred. The principle of no statute of limitations on crimes against humanity has become established in international law. This means that perpetrators can be prosecuted regardless of how much time has passed. A war crime committed in 1945 can still be prosecuted in 2020. A genocide committed decades ago can still be prosecuted today. This principle has enabled the prosecution of numerous perpetrators who escaped immediate justice. It has enabled the pursuit of justice even when decades have passed. In the 2010s and 2020s, elderly perpetrators of Nazi crimes have continued to be prosecuted. A 90-year-old former guard at a concentration camp was tried and convicted. A man in his 90s was prosecuted for his role in administering a concentration camp. Even those who participated in atrocities decades ago can face justice. This continuing prosecution is possible because of the principle established at Nuremberg. Accountability transcends time. The crimes do not disappear just because time has passed. The responsibility does not diminish just because perpetrators have grown old. The Nuremberg principles have also been applied to new forms of conflict. When the United States and NATO intervened in Kosovo, there were investigations into possible war crimes. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, there were immediately investigations into possible war crimes and crimes against humanity. The International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for current leaders based on alleged crimes against humanity. The principle established at Nuremberg, that leaders can be held criminally liable, is being applied to contemporary conflicts. But Nuremberg's legacy extends beyond formal legal institutions. It has shaped how the world thinks about accountability. It has established a norm that atrocities demand justice. It has created an expectation that perpetrators will face accountability. This norm is not universally followed. Many perpetrators of atrocities in recent conflicts have escaped justice, but the norm exists. The expectation is that accountability will be pursued. The executions of the 15 Nazi leaders at Nuremberg established a precedent that has shaped history. They demonstrated that accountability was possible. They demonstrated that even the most powerful perpetrators could face justice. For survivors of the Holocaust, the Nuremberg verdicts and executions were significant. They provided acknowledgement that what had been done to them was wrong. They provided recognition that the perpetrators were guilty. They provided a degree of justice, even if it could never fully compensate for what had been lost. For the world, Nuremberg established that crimes against humanity would not be tolerated. It established that the international community would pursue justice. It established that even in the chaos of post-war Europe, accountability was possible. In the decades since Nuremberg, this message has been repeated many times. Each new war crimes tribunal reaffirms the principle. Each prosecution of an elderly perpetrator reaffirms the principle. Each conviction sends the message, you cannot commit crimes against humanity and escape justice. The 15 Nazi leaders executed at Nuremberg are long dead. The era of Nazi perpetrators is largely past. The last survivors of the Nazi era are dying of old age. But their legacy continues. The legal principles they helped establish at Nuremberg continue to shape international law. The precedent they set continues to influence how the world responds to atrocities. The executions continue to serve as a warning to would-be perpetrators. Justice is possible, even decades later. The Nuremberg Trial is often cited as an example of victor's justice. The losing side was punished, while the winning side escaped scrutiny. This criticism has some validity. Soviet participation in judging the Nazis is problematic, given Soviet atrocities. But the principle established at Nuremberg transcends these criticisms. The principle that leaders can be held criminally liable for crimes against humanity is important and has proven valuable in subsequent decades. In a world where atrocities continue to occur, where war crimes are committed with apparent impunity, where perpetrators seem to escape justice, Nuremberg stands as a reminder that accountability is possible. It stands as a precedent that can be followed. The executions of the 15 Nazi leaders thus represent more than just historical events. They represent a statement to the world. Those who commit crimes against humanity will be held responsible. They represent the beginning of modern international criminal justice. As we continue to face crimes against humanity in the contemporary world, as we struggle to hold perpetrators accountable, the legacy of Nuremberg remains relevant. It reminds us that justice is possible. It reminds us that accountability can be achieved. It reminds us that even the most powerful perpetrators can face justice. The 15 Nazi leaders who were executed at Nuremberg paid the ultimate price for their crimes. But their executions did more than just punish individuals. They established a principle that has shaped history. Those who commit crimes against humanity will be held accountable. That principle continues to guide international justice today. That principle continues to inspire those who pursue accountability for atrocities. That principle stands as a warning to potential perpetrators. Justice will be pursued, no matter how long it takes. The executions at Nuremberg changed the meaning of justice. They established that accountability was possible. They established that even leaders of defeated nations could be held criminally liable. They established precedents that continue to shape international law and international practice today. That is the legacy of Nuremberg. That is the legacy of the 15 executions. That is a legacy that continues to matter, more than 75 years later.